also is that soil is the basis for global biodiversity, terrestrial biodiversity. It's clearly an international concern, and what Luke is saying in relation to all of the issues relating to dry lands applies to soil more generally as well. Certainly, soil is the basis for all terrestrial food, and arguably for marine food sources as well in relation to the nutrients that go into the sea. And clearly also from the point of view of climate change, soil carbon sequestration is now recognized as being of crucial significance, with the organic content of soil being a very significant aspect as a carbon sink. So let there be no doubt that soil issues are global issues. They are also regional issues. If you look at various of the maps of land degradation, we see that there are some countries that are very severely affected, including Australia, which several of us come from. But if you look at Iceland, Iceland itself has got huge problems, but it's also got the oldest soil conservation organisation in the world. It's now, I think, 105 years old. And so Iceland has done a lot in this respect, including in particular the drafting of soil legislation. China, where I'm now closely associated, more closely associated, it also has huge problems to do with land degradation. As far as risk of desertification is concerned, we've already set that out in detail. I don't need to go into that, but we do know that there are some very high levels of risk in a range of countries and pretty much on every continent. So the UNCCD has done some magnificent work, particularly in the last few years, in highlighting this question of livelihood and ecosystem well-being and the health of soils in relation to the maintenance of both human life as well as life in general. And clearly we see, as the paragraphs that Luke has mentioned also say, that the countries at Rio+20 have given support to both the economic and social significance of land management, including soil, in relation to economic growth, biodiversity, agriculture, food security, poverty, women's empowerment, addressing climate change and improving water availability. You cannot avoid taking into account soil in any of these. It also recognised these issues here in relation to desertification, land degradation and drought, which are matters of global dimension. So just in the last year or so, there's been a much greater focus on what is now called zero net land degradation. And one of the things that this particular policy brief that was just published in May this year, just before Rio+20, recommends is the development of a protocol to the CCD on zero net land degradation as a first and vital step to perhaps a broader approach. This particular workshop has the focus at a broader level as well, and it seems to me that we need to actually work on both, but certainly the first step is a protocol under the UNCCD. What we do argue, though, is that because of the broader issues involved outside dry lands as well as within them, in terms of making links to biodiversity, climate change, and so on, and in particular in relation to management of land that is contaminated, as Rob Fowler will talk about, we need to think also through whether or not over the next few years we should have a sustainable soils convention for all lands, which is generally applicable. So there are a range of things that the UNCCD protocol on soil and zero net land degradation could facilitate, and if you look at the last pages of this particular report on zero net land degradation, you'll find all of these points made in justifying a protocol on ZNLD to the UNCCD. And in particular, in terms of the incorporation of emerging economic instruments, particularly payment for ecosystem services, in order to focus on sequestration, water conservation, and so on. The negotiation of verifiable targets, one of the ideas, one of the very strong points that is made both in Rio+20 and elsewhere, is that we should, over the next 20 years or so, be very serious about actually meeting the target of zero net land degradation. but also importantly in relation to a protocol that we need to think through what happens at a national level and what happens at a regional level, and we'll be talking more about that later in this workshop. But certainly the focus that has been a real effort in the last few years is to look at models for national and subnational policies within legal frameworks to promote soil degradation as such. What then is the rationale for a zero net land degradation protocol as a first step? One could say, well, look at the other conventions. They've all got protocols for implementation of various aspects of what they do, but the CCD does not. And you might say, well, you know, that in itself is not competition, but at the same time, the other conventions have recognised that it is very important for implementing provisions to be carried out, and clearly a framework convention such as climate change does need something like Kyoto and its successor to actually be successful. But similarly with the CBD, with biosafety protocol and then the Nagoya protocol on access and benefit sharing, again, specific provisions in those protocols. As far as zero net land degradation is concerned, it needs to have a focus which is legally enforceable, legally justifiable in terms of ensuring that the provisions of the UNCCD are adequately carried out. So the aim of ZNLD is fairly specific, the achievement of land degradation neutrality, whereby land degradation is either avoided or offset by land restoration. That is the definition that has been developed over the past few months in relation to this, working on, or at least based on the work that Luke Nakaja and others have done within the CCD itself. One point I should make, though, is that the whole idea of zero net land degradation certainly applies to dry lands, but it's also more generally applicable. And this is something that we need to take into account when thinking through what goes beyond the CCD as far as a global convention on soil is concerned. So I won't go through all of this, but if you want to read more about it, you'll see in this report, as well as another one that will be published relatively soon, you'll see that there's a whole range of ways in which zero net land degradation can address the aims of the CCD. I don't need to go through the history too much in terms of the development of the global soil instrument, but suffice to say, over the past 12 years or so, a huge amount has been done, particularly through Ian and the group, in relation to the various resolutions that the IUCN has put forward in terms of the experience that has been accumulated and the many publications that the group has put forward. Perhaps the three most, the three heaviest ones are the ones that are at the back, and you should feel free to take a copy of those dating from 2002 through to 2011, and Ian will talk more about the last one shortly. But the group in the last few years has put forward a whole range of other publications as well, and no doubt for those of you who are interested in this, you'll be able to look them up. But as Luke was indicating, soil as an issue has been what I would call the poor cousin of a great deal of the environment conventions, the multilateral environmental agreements from the 1970s through to the present day. And what we argue is that soil as a vital biological resource demands urgent and specific attention on the same level as biodiversity and the effects of climate change. So when we think more broadly then about the role of the international convention, the fundamental role is really to stimulate regional and national action by motivating states to legislate or reform legislation for soil protection. And such legislation can be sketched out within the elements of the convention itself in order to provide the legal, ecological and policy requirements for sustainable management of soil, or SLM, sustainable land management, incorporating ecological principles for security and sustainable use, and consolidating various elements of existing international policies as they have been drafted over the past 20 years or so, but also to actually forge links between the soil-related instruments as well as the others, and in particular CBD, the Climate Change Convention, the CCD, and perhaps also the Forest Principles. So one of the things that we have had to consider over the past 12 years is whether or not you need a standalone soil convention which covers everything, whether you might just have a framework treaty which then requires further protocols, or to have a protocol to the existing convention. And for 3 or 4 years we actually debated this question of whether or not you have a protocol to the Desertification Convention, the Framework Convention on Climate Change and Biodiversity, or to have a non-binding instrument which does much the same thing. Well, as lawyers, we don't like non-binding instruments too much, but sometimes that's all you can achieve. But the dilemma is then, and this is based on the work that has been done through the group, the dilemma is that in looking at soil issues, we see that soil is relevant to each of what we now call the Rio Conventions. But none of the instruments is entirely satisfactory as a vehicle by itself to address all of the issues that need to be addressed when we're thinking about soil security and sustainable use beyond drylands. So that dilemma then has produced a whole range of ways in which to look at this, and one of them is to draft a protocol, which we have here, which was presented in Buenos Aires in Argentina in September 2009, to the Conference of the Parties number 9 of the Convention on Desertification, and then a further version being presented by one of our colleagues, Michael Kidd, in Durban last year. So we see that there's on the one hand a focus on a protocol, but the debate has also been shifting to say, what about the broader issues? And they're the broader issues that I'm talking about in terms of convention. When we think about mechanisms for which might be incorporated in a convention on security and sustainable use of soil, we see that these are the kinds of things that need to be taken into account. We need to take a holistic and integrated approach. We need to develop synergistic mechanisms between the Rio Conventions. We need to focus on specific issues, particularly in terms of living conditions, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of food security, and we need to think about what legislative mechanisms ought to be generated at national level. So, to conclude, one of the things that I would say in terms of looking at the whole history of the development of environmental law in, let's say, the last 50 years or so, there is a gap in international environmental law as far as soil in general is concerned. The Desertification Convention, of course, is starting to deal more effectively with the issues in drylands, but what we would argue is that we need to go beyond that. Perhaps we can debate that later in the session. But clearly, one of the focuses, as I've said, will be to promote a significant reform of soil conservation legislation at the national level, and that a convention on sustainable soil would be in addition to and assist with the implementation of the UN Convention on Desertification itself. Thank you very much.
I remember the whole process since we were in Iceland and then in Buenos Aires, and it's true that we have within the specialist group discussed a lot about which would be the best way, if a convention on its own or a protocol to one of them already in place. But for sure, this zero net land degradation is a first and vital step. Now we have Professor Ian Hanam. He is the chair of the CEL Specialist Group on Sustainable Use of Soil and Desertification. and also professor at the Australian Centre for Agriculture and Law of the University of New England. He will speak about the regional role and benefits of an international soil instrument, examples from the Asian region, regional cooperation and coordination in managing soil security and soil protection issues.
Thank you, Shayla. I would also like to acknowledge the support you've given us over the last 8 years. And I also acknowledge the presence of Luke at this event. It's a very pleasure to have you here. And of course I need to acknowledge the support of all the members of the specialist group over the years in the role that they've played in the development of this particular area of work. The country Iceland has been mentioned a few times already, and this photograph on the top right-hand corner of this slide is a photograph of an area of Iceland where you can see a very substantial amount of soil has been lost from the impacts of, in particular, grazing management and the effects of wind and water on the soils in that particular country. Well, the aim of my short presentation today is to give a brief outline of the basis for regional collaboration and interest in a soil instrument, the role and benefits of an international soil instrument at the regional level, and to cover two examples in particular where regional collaboration has been going on for some time now in the protection of soils, and that's in Northeast Asia and in an area of Central Asia. Well, in brief, the role of an international soil instrument at the regional level could include such things as the recognition of sovereign rights, but also to encourage regional cooperation, to include legal mechanisms to enable regional cooperation,